who is the Joe Rogan of Canada? There isn't really one. So I think that somebody kind of has to like rise up a little bit and try to aspire, because I just kind of feel like you don't see these kinds of conversations happen in Canadian politics very often. There is a kind of sense that we are at the end of the Trudeau era, and what was that era defined by when we look back at it in retrospect? Like, what do you think is the most seductive to them about some of this more radical politics?
We're giving Trump as much dopamine as possible by he gets to see the map of like red Canada,
Yeah,
red Greenland, or whatever, and he'll get the
yeah, yeah.
dopamine from it. But he gets the success of invading and winning over Canada without ever doing it. Right. Thanks for joining me today, JJ. Um, Honestly, a little bit nervous for this interview, so I guess I kind of want to start with how we ended up connecting and basically what makes you kind of interested in talking to me and like what kinds of commonalities we might have that we can discuss in this interview.
Yeah, sounds good.
Um, Basically, it starts a little bit with me just cold emailing a bunch of the podcasters like Drag or Art Chad. Like it was like horseshoe theory, and then honestly, I discovered you through the Destiny's Bridges podcast, and um, being like a kind of American politics junkie, I was actually kind of surprised I hadn't really heard of you or like interacted with you that much before. But hearing some of the things you said in that was kind of like really inspiring to me as far as how your conservative like temperament is basically under attack in like the modern age, and how like you don't really necessarily have that great of a political home because of some of like the rhetoric on like the far right and like the populists that have been kind of like ratcheted up, and they don't have as much like respect for the institutions and democracy that you so value and like treasure. So
Mm.
um again, I basically just want to start with, because my story is basically I just got really sad after the election and kind of just poured a lot of my thoughts into a video. It was kind of a just a creative outlet for me. But then I I ended up being pretty happy with the end result, so I emailed you and you ended up responding. And I want you to kind of go through that with me and tell me like why did you end up responding? Like what makes you interested in some of like my work or my thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm always inspired, I think, when young people are trying to sort of get more involved in this sort of space, in the commentary space and the video making space. You know, I appreciated that you sent me this video that you had made reflecting on the Democrats' loss in the recent presidential election. I suppose fortuitously, I was just about to go on a big walk, as I often do, and you know that was when I read your email, and you had made this video that was like 45 minutes long or something, and I'm like, okay, well, I can listen to this kid's video as I go for my walk and see if there's anything to this, and I don't know, and I thought that your analysis seemed very measured and calm and rational and logical and all that. You know, you spend a lot of time sort of analyzing this little episode in a Jubilee video. And I thought that some of your takes on that and sort of like the question of you know, kind of liberal condescension towards conservatives, I thought was a kind of interesting take. So I don't know. I mean, you seemed like a moderate person, and I feel like I'm always sort of drawn to that kind of disposition as well. People who seem to be sort of sincerely moderate in spirit and sort of curious about the world and curious about sort of the different ways that rhetoric on both the left and the right manifests, and how sort of a lot of our contemporary politics is a sort of game of competing rhetorical styles as much as it is a game of principles. And so I think that your kind of like savvy understanding of that made me realize that, you know, yeah, you seem like a bright young man who is maybe sort of thinking about politics in sort of the correct way, as opposed to just in a kind of demagogic sort of tribal way that I think too many people are engaging these days.
The correct centrist moderate way, yes.
Well, you know, I mean, I think that's the more
No.
honest way, really, when you like if your goal is to like actually understand the political moment that we're in, and you know, fair enough, like that's a different goal than maybe achieving a victory in the political sort of situation that we're in. But, if the goal is to just understand, then I do think you have to kind of transcend tribalism and ideology in that kind of way, and instead just sort of try to be as honest as you can and understanding what's actually going on, and sort of speak uh, in a sort of sincere way about what you're observing. And I think the audience benefits, especially in these polarized times, when you have somebody that just states clearly and unequivocally what is happening and what they are observing, even when that
Right.
contradicts or unflatters one side more than another.
Yeah. Frankly, I am like it's almost to the point where I'm almost just sick of the word like polarization and like kind of sick and tired of
Yeah, me too.
hearing about it or just like reading like every single headline like we're more polarized than ever, and it's just like
Yeah, yeah.
okay, like we've known that. It was like the word of the year for 2021, I think, and it's like yes, it's getting worse, but I don't see a lot of good efforts trying to make it better, frankly.
Well, and,
And
and what I said, I remember this came up when I was talking with Destiny, right? It's like, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that, like, polarization is not a frivolous thing, right? Like, it's not just kind of something that people sort of stumble into because they're dopes or because they're not paying attention. Like, it's not like getting hit by a car because you failed to look both ways before you cross the street or something, right? Like, polarization is just in some ways a kind of natural state in a political climate where there are substantial disagreements about sort of substantial policy issues, philosophical principles, moral sort of evaluations, and all of that. So, the question of the idea that you can just kind of like wave the magic wand and make the polarization go away, which, dishonest politicians often promise to do, is, I think, a very sort of like insincere promise, because it does not, it's just not engaged with what the roots of polarization are, which I think are much more deeper and substantial and legitimate than just, people hating each other for its own sake.
right, it reminds me of the analysis of Jubilee that you brought up, and just how successful they've gotten. I would say like monetizing polarization, and honestly, like just not just them, like just a lot of these political commentators or um, like I would call like the political like hobbyist sphere, basically, where it's all just a bunch of talking heads like batting back and forth, but never necessarily engage with like the underlying principles. But it just seems really easy to find like the worst examples of both sides, which is what I said. Like Jubilee is just so good at doing, and
Yeah.
that's why I basically want to kind of find more like moderates or people with like a little bit more measured expertise that aren't looking to score points. And that kind of brings me into something I've been really interested for you and hopeful for you, frankly, is one of your pinned tweets about um, you have a standing invitation for basically all three of the leaders of our major political parties, the NDP, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party. And so far, no one's taken you up, but it's just the beginning of 2025, so you've got a long way to go, or a lot of time, and there are like every pundit's basically calling the previous American election the podcast election, and a lot of the analysis
Mm.
has been, oh, like you gotta capture the young men, like you gotta meet the people where they're at. Like the formats are changing. Long form podcasts are the future. That's what like Lex Friedman and Elon said, and everything. So I kind of want to ask you about what your vision for that is, and also how you might want to try to choose to differentiate yourself from the Joe Rogans or the Jubilees or the kind of more um, pop politics, I think you would call it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I can only aspire to having the reach of some of those sorts of channels. Like, I mean, I'm close to 1 million subscribers, but I am my videos are
Right.
not like routinely pulling in like 5 million viewers and stuff. So I have to have sort
I
of
would say
begin, I
it's
guess, with
fair
a
to
more sort of
compare it
modest
to, like, on
ambition.
the Canadian sense, right?
Yeah, yeah. Maybe
Like
if you
like in
sort
our
of think that, like,
population,
by
yeah.
definition, everything in Canada is sort of like scaled down tenfold from its closest US equivalent. And so, and that's why I sort of extended the invitation, was because you're right. Like, yeah, I'm not Joe Rogan, but who is the Joe Rogan of Canada? There isn't really one. So I think that somebody kind of has to like rise up a little bit and try to aspire to at least provide a, internet-based platform that is, watched by a kind of like broad, younger audience who get their news and their facts about the world primarily through platforms like YouTube. And I know just from talking to people, from people who just recognize me on the street and stuff, that I do function in my own modest way
It's the
as a
cansplainer.
big source of information. Yeah, no, I mean, I do function as a big source of information about this country to a lot of people in this country, and to a lot of people around the world as well. And so it's like that's a great honor and great privilege, and it's something I'm happy and I'm proud to have to my name. And so I'm just sort of thinking, like, well, in the context of this election, I think it behooves people like me to be in a position that I'm in to, offer a platform to allow my young viewers and other young people who use the internet a chance to kind of see our nation's candidates for prime minister in a kind of up close way, in a way that is, frankly, not often done in Canada. I mean, it hasn't been often done in America until quite recently either. But would be valuable, and I think would ideally present another side of these people, these men who are running for our nation's highest job, just to be able to view them in a slightly different way, in a slightly different context. So, like, that's the aspiration. Like, I think it'd be nice if I could sit down with Pierre and with Jagmeet and with, I guess, no longer Trudeau, whoever winds up replacing Trudeau, and we could have a conversation for maybe 2 hours or so, something in that kind of space, in which we could just kind of like talk a bit casually. Like, I mean, I'm obviously a very political person. I have strong opinions on a whole bunch of issues, but I don't aspire to like have a gotcha interview. I even with somebody like Jagmeet, who I don't really agree with on a lot of things, and I've disagreed with a lot of the ways that he's conducted himself over the last few years. I still feel like I'd like to get to know him a bit as a person. I'd like to be able to sort of, maybe turn off my own political biases a bit, uh, and just kind of like learn a bit about his life and why he thinks the things that he does and how he kind of got into this moment. And same with Trudeau, and same with whoever our new prime minister will be, because I just kind of feel like you don't see these kinds of conversations happen in Canadian politics very often. Uh, there are not creators that have a broad enough audience to the point where the politicians view it worth their time to sort of sit down with these people. And but also conversely, I think that in the aftermath of the American election, it has never been, you know, as obvious as it is now, um, the degree that sort of non-traditional media is actually much more popular and much more influential than I think a lot of people have suspected, and that even a sort of smaller channel can actually have a great deal of influence with a certain sort of audience, a sort of low attention audience, in the sense of like people that don't normally pay that much attention to politics, people that are maybe use the internet primarily to learn about other things. There's a very rare opportunity to be able to sort of harness that attention and direct it towards a politician's sort of political brand. So that's basically like what my aspiration is that use my platforms, let the politicians use the platforms to introduce themselves, sort of allow me as a kind of stand in for my own audience to kind of get to know these people a little bit better, ask questions that are sort of sincere and curious and not just gotcha questions, not just questions that are geared towards embarrassing them or forcing them to kind of clarify their positions that they don't want to clarify solely for the purposes of sort of shaming them or attacking them in a kind of like partisan kind of way. Like, that's not the goal at all. And so we'll see. I'm hoping that as the election gets underway, uh, it will seem self-evident to sit down with me in the same way that it seems self-evident to Trump's people to sit down with all of the many, many podcasters and YouTubers that he wound up sitting down with.
Right. Do you foresee the CBC article where Freeland loses in a massive blowout or whatever, and then it's like Freeland should have went on JJ McCullough. And
Well, I mean, I definitely think there could be something to that. Like, I feel relatively confident. Pierre, I know to some extent. Like, I've met him and hung out with him a couple of times in sort of more casual sort of settings, and so I feel relatively confident that he'd probably come on and chat with me, and I'd be eager to see him again. Um, I could imagine though that like. The liberal people and the NDP people will be like, well, JJ McCullough, noted crackpot. There's nothing to be gained from dignifying him. It's just and I do think like I would be very impressed, and I think it would reflect very well on the liberal and NDP leader if they were willing to hang out with somebody who is, yeah, a conservative in a Canadian sort of partisan kind of context. I mean, I haven't been shy about that, but I think that if you're in a bad position in the polls, as the Liberals and the NDP are, you have to kind of reach out not just to non-traditional media, but to non-traditional, hosts like myself, people that are maybe a little bit out of your sort of partisan comfort zone, but have the possibility to speak to an audience of people that are maybe persuadable, as I think my audience would be. My audience is vast and diverse and sort of multi-partisan in sense of their ideological leanings. So yeah, I mean, like if the goal is to kind of grow your profile a bit, I think, I'm worth a try. And then you have to ask, like, if not me, then what's the alternative? Is it just going to do interviews with CBC and CTV and just do a very traditional campaign in the leader bus, as they say, and just kind of shake hands at the nursing home and stuff like that, and hope that that's enough to revive your pardon me, your sort of your declining party. I don't think so. I think you have to be willing to try some new things.
yeah, I think it's fair to say like the onus is on them, and they have to be willing to experiment at least. To
Yeah.
Because if they say they're like a big portion of perhaps like the carbon tax discourse they say is like a largely like a misinformation problem or like a communications problem. So if that's something they actually care
Mm.
about like alleviating, then that is probably something worth having a long form like conversation about, more so than just like the 10 to 15 minutes that you can get on power and politics or like any TV interview. It's just it's it, even the interviews that have gone on there with our who's our the finance guy. um
Dominic LeBlanc.
they no Giro, or I don't know, Giraux. uh like not the PMO, are like whoever does the internal investigations for like the finance. They're like the PBO officer. What's his name?
Oh yeah, the parliamentary budget officer.
Yeah, PBO.
Yeah,
I saw
I know
his
who you're talking
episode.
about. Yeah,
Yeah, I saw his episode for like
with who?
15 minutes. It was on Power and Politics
Oh,
with I forget the hostess's name, but
Rosemary Barton.
um, I don't think so. But anyways, it was because it just didn't do that. I feel like they've always done a weird job going back and forth with whether or not it's like a redistribution scheme or whether or not it's like climate oriented. And of course, it can be
Mm.
both, but like the messaging on that has been, I would say, like stilted, and it's something that could be a little bit like more well explained over the form of like a 2 hour like long podcast where you get to kind of humanize some of like the thoughts behind it and the efforts behind it and like the reasons it does work and was so widely endorsed by economists, um, and also the reasons why the public seems to be so against it, regardless of whatever acts of tax rhetoric, um, and like like the rationale for like the Atlantic Canada carve out, like those are the kinds of
Yeah,
things that I feel like the public kind of deserves answers to, but there's no sense that those answers are going to come from TV interviews.
yeah,
um,
yeah.
it's
And I mean,
difficult.
it's an interesting thing to think about as well, because it's sort of like, do the politicians resort to these very short, sort of sound bitey kind of slogans to explain their controversial policies because the medium limits their ability to say anything more? Or do they cling to these sort of slogans because that's all they have, right? And that's like a very open debate in sort of political rhetoric, right? So like the conservatives would say, say with the carbon tax or whatever, it's that they don't have any good justification for it. All they have is slogans. And it's like, okay, that's one theory of the case. But if you're having a long, extended conversation with a proponent of the carbon tax, yeah, would they be actually able to spell out a more, kind of comprehensive, persuasive case for it? Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But it's definitely, an opportunity that they're not often presented with just because the nature of the medium, I think, does, you know, bias itself towards kind of more snippy and often quite defensive answers that are sort of being provoked by hosts that are, often trying to really sort of drill you down and put you in the hot seat and make you accountable for something controversial.
In the few interviews you have done in your time, like, um, what are some strategies that you think have have proved like successful in basically, because we talked a little bit off camera about how you want to basically be friendly and to somewhat humanize and give that measured sense to politics as opposed to like the gotcha questions. Um, but it's also difficult to tread that line without becoming what I would say is like kind of just like a softball interviewer. Like
Yeah,
I would say like Lex or like Joe Rogan, where they basically only focus on, like love and peace and like let's just be friends or whatever, but like they never really end up
yeah,
getting
yeah,
to like the meat of the issues or whatever. So,
yeah,
and it's not like anyone
yeah.
has like a perfect answer for this, but I'm curious how you choose to tread that line between getting to the answers and being friendly.
Well, I mean, I don't like overly combative interviews. I mean, that's kind of my personal bias. Like, I don't like these kind of BBC style interviews you see go viral every so often where the host is just incredibly hostile and it's just like it's very prosecutorial, right? It's like almost like that the interviewee is somebody on trial and that you're really trying to like, nail them, get them found guilty or whatever. But I generally think that when people are given it, like when the host is informed, right? Like, and I do think this is kind of like the problem with Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan and people like that who like just aren't very politically smart, in my opinion. Like their depth of knowledge of politics is quite shallow. It's why they always kind of have to like beg for their audience to tell them what they should ask questions about and that kind of stuff because they don't
Yeah, yeah.
instinctively know what matters, right? And
They
as a
don't do
result,
their
they
own
also become
research. They
quite easy.
just, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then as a result, they become pretty easy marks for sloganeering and stuff. And like arguments that sound right to them, they just kind of like accept and don't really push back against and all of that. I mean, I think that an interviewer doesn't have to be combative and hostile, but he does have to ask, somewhat provocative questions, questions that will inspire interesting and revealing answers from the guest, right? And I think that if you ask enough sort of provocative and revealing and interesting and kind of complex questions that gets the guests to open up a bit and sort of speak to their fundamental worldview and how they sort of perceive these sort of political problems in a kind of like broad sense, you know, then you might like what you hear or you might not like what you hear. But the fact is, I do think that when a politician is given a chance to speak honestly, that is what's in the interest of the viewer. It allows the viewer to gain information that makes him be able to then make an informed decision at the ballot box. But you have to know what you're talking about. You have to know what the stakes of politics are. You have to know what the current debates of our time are, and you have to be willing to, again, like not ask the politicians to, go on the record in a kind of like overly narrow prosecutorial way. But you do have to be willing to ask, like, okay, well, let's talk about the environment. Let's talk about taxes. Let's talk about housing and foreign policy and these kinds of things. But let's hopefully the host is savvy enough to, kind of like know where there are where there are kind of like blind spots or flaws or cliches or sort of subjects that are worth drilling down on a little bit more. Like, oh, can you answer this a little bit more with more clarity? Like, what do you mean by that? Let's get a little bit deeper. Well, what is your definition of this term? And why does that matter? And like these kinds of things. And the more you're willing to kind of like ask kind of like thoughtful and revealing questions, the more I do think that actually, an experience I've often had when I have done interviews, and I don't do that many interviews. I did more when I was doing more sort of standard journalistic-y kind of things. But I think that when you ask the right kind of questions, questions that invite a bit of self-reflection or politicians to kind of like state their principles in a kind of more comprehensive way. Politicians like that because it's different and it's refreshing and it's new and it's flattering to them in some ways. And so I have had politicians thank me and they say like, well, those were thoughtful questions. Those were interesting questions. Those were better questions than the kind of questions I'm usually asked because they give me a chance as a politician to kind of speak where I'm actually coming from. And I do think that kind of stuff is something that is lacking quite a bit these days, particularly in the Canadian media scene.
Right. It's like we say, we're not really coming up with anything new. We're just reinventing the old. And like you've said to me, like
Mm,
you're a little bit um, scared of like the interview idea just because you feel like it's been like done to death or whatever. But you also
yeah,
acknowledge that like that there's just like a significant portion of like today's youth that just haven't been through like that kind of gauntlet of like interviews or like they've only really seen like the kind of short clips online or TV interviews or
yeah,
whatever. So it is perhaps like a ripe field for re-engagement, frankly, where you can ask those kinds of more complex questions, which of course like a longer format lends itself better to, and then you can develop a more of a rapport with all these like politicians, and then they'll be continually like more willing to like reveal themselves over the course of 2 hours
yeah,
as opposed to 20 minutes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I do think that like a lot of young people have not been exposed enough to an interview where the primary goal is to sort of like acquire information, right? A lot of interviews are either too casual when it's just kind of like buddy buddy and like let's crack jokes and just kind of be off topic and kind of goofing off, or interviews where everything like interviews that are in the kind of like more old fashioned journalistic way where it's all about just kind of like nailing accountability for the politician as it relates to the controversy of the moment, right? So it's like you imagine that if we were having an interview with some politician right now, and like let's say the only thing we talked about was like the Trump tariffs, and Trudeau has just resigned, and Premier Ford's recent energy sort of overture to the US, just kind of like very narrow of the moment kind of things that make the interview get dated very quickly. And frankly, I just don't think that a lot of people really care that much about that kind of instantaneous uh, accountability for fleeting events in the news cycle. I think people would like to hear kind of just more substantial, just gather more substantial gather more substantial information about who this politician is as a person, how their worldview is shaped, what their basic principles are, what their basic goals are, and then that kind of stuff. So you kind of get a better sense of what makes this person tick, and then ultimately what they would be like in office, because when you become prime minister, when you have a job like this, there's so much that will define your tenure that is unknowable in the present. Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. What he's dealing with now in 2025, none of us could have seen coming, and he couldn't have seen coming. But if you had a kind of understanding of who he was in 2015, not based on his policy positions necessarily in 2015, but just kind of like based on how he sees the world and how he reacts to things and what his general sort of moral first principles are and all of that, then you might have some broad sense of what he would be up to in 2025 and how he would be dealing with sort of theoretical issues that, would have arisen. So, yeah, that's basically where I come at these kinds of things. And I'm setting myself a high bar here. I hope I can live up to my own sort of lofty pretensions when I get
Yeah.
a chance to actually do this kind of stuff. Because I'm not. I mean, the other thing too is that it's easy to sort of sit on the outside and be like, I could do a better interview than that. But interviewing is an art. It's a skill. It's a talent. It's something that. often takes people a great deal of time to get good at. And, I don't have a ton of experience at it, but I'm hoping that, one of my resolutions for 2025 is to start doing more of it, and to try to, grow my own skills as somebody who's mostly been on the other end. I do a lot of interviews. I listen
Yeah.
to a lot of interviews, but my ability to actually be on the other side is something that I'm sure I need to improve on.
On that note, I kind of want to talk a little bit about um, obviously the present news of the week, but I want to try to take a little bit of more historical perspective, frankly, so the interview doesn't become outdated in like a week. Um,
Yes.
and obviously, the Trudeau resignation um, is, I'll say, at a really bad and crucial time for Canada, as far as
Yes.
our conflicts and um, just all like all the state of our economic affairs and immigration and our incoming trade war with the U.S. It's a really crucial point, and we're kind of just in this like limbo or prorogation where it seems like we really lack leadership, and that's disappointing. But like you say, I think it's interesting how no one could have predicted this in 2015, say. But what what makes you think that you might have had more inclinations as far as the populist wave? Like you've written in some of your older Washington Post op-eds about how certain things of the Liberal Party were devolving into political theater, like for example, like the carbon tax, or certain things like the Israel Palestine conflict and how we spent weeks in Parliament whether or not that was a genocide or whether or not we should seize weapons. So Uh, I was wondering, to frame this into a question. Um, I want to ask you, like, what you think you'll think of the Trudeau administration in 2040. Like, what, where did he, where did he succeed? Where did he go wrong? That kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very big question, and it's a question that a lot of people are sort of being forced to grapple with in the wake of news that, he's not going to be prime minister for much longer. So there is a kind of sense that we are at the end of the Trudeau era, and what was that era defined by when we look back at it in retrospect? I mean, I do think at the end of the day, Trudeau was a prime minister who was much more interested in sort of social policy than uh, financial policy, economic policy. And I think that his lack of interest in economics, kind of speaks for itself, in the sense that I think that his legacy is defined by a period of quite substantial economic stagnation for this country. Cost of living has risen for many Canadians. This is partially a result of COVID sort of inspired inflation, but I think is also partially a product of economic mismanagement of a country, or of a government that hasn't prioritized the kind of pro-growth policies that we would need to sort of stay competitive in a fast-changing economic landscape. And so I think that when you sort of think about why the Liberal Party is likely to lose in a big landslide in this year's coming parliamentary election, whenever that winds up being, it's mostly because Canadians just feel a pinch of a poorly performing economy, that they don't view this government as having done nearly enough to address. And so I think that, sometimes prime ministers go down for scandal. Sometimes prime ministers go down for, just personal reasons. And I think Justin Trudeau is going down because of economic ones. I think that when we look at his sort of social policy agenda, you know, I think people can find fault with it, but it seems like not that contested, really. I mean, certainly when I think you look at sort of the things that he was prattling off and sort of saying were in his resignation speech, the things that he imagines as being the defining moments of his prime ministership. One of the things he said was, reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples. I think that has become a very sort of dominant kind of cultural uh, you know, phenomenon in Canada in the late 2010s and early 2020s. The idea that Indigenous Canadian culture is now sort of present all over the place, everywhere. Whether that's land acknowledgements, or whether or not that's sort of indigenous art at the bank, or you know classrooms and universities sort of teaching mandatory indigenous history and indigenous sort of like cultural knowledge and this kind of stuff. Like, that is very present in Canadian life, and from what I can tell, it's not really that contested. So that seems to me like it's a pretty sort of successful Trudeau cultural legacy, the idea of sort of defining the Canadian identity, understanding that identity to have a sort of substantial sort of indigenous component to it. That seems like something that is not going to be undone anytime soon. And the Conservative Party doesn't even really express any interest in undoing it. So I think like that's something that we'll look back on. um I think that a less sort of positive domestic or sort of social policy is immigration. And I think that one of the reasons why the immigration system has now become so controversial in this country is because Trudeau has primarily thought of it as a social policy rather than an economic one, or rather than one as a population growth policy that then inflicts all of the challenges that a rapidly growing population, forces upon the host country. I think Justin Trudeau has historically thought of immigration as something that is good because it makes Canada more diverse and multicultural, and that sort of diversity is our strength. Canada is not. Well, he used to have this line that he used to always say. Like, Canada is not a country that sort of like is. I can't even remember exactly how he puts it. It's sort of
Something
something like
we're
we're
like a
not.
post-national state, something like that, right?
No, not even that. I think that line is actually quite overrated. I wrote something about
Okay.
that recently. But no, he says something like we're not a good country in spite of our differences. We're a good
We're good.
country
Okay.
because of our differences, something
Right.
along
Right.
those lines, right? And like that's all well and good. I think that most Canadians sort of like broadly agree that diversity has been one of the positive characteristics of this country. But the thing is that sort of when you have an immigration system that raises immigration to unprecedented highs, as Trudeau has, simply on the basis that immigrants could not possibly cause any problems in any context ever, and because he sort of, I think, has imagined that our traditional way, or at least immigration critics' traditional way of understanding the problems with immigration, are cultural in nature, which is to say, oh, they don't fit in, they bring bad ideas, bad, kind of cultural characteristics to the country. Because he has sort of no time for those kind of arguments, I think he's sort of blinded himself to the possibility that too much immigration can cause problems for other reasons, in the sense of driving up just demand for all public services, which then drives up prices, and especially when it comes to supply and demand in the housing market, especially when it comes to just basic infrastructure like roads and public transit, and things like that are sort of designed to accommodate a sort of fixed number of people that has now, the population has sort of exceeded that. And then the sort of the job side of things, that is more contested as a matter of economics. But I think that the case is not hard to make that a lot of the immigrants that have been brought into the country in the last decade or so have wound up being in, kind of rather menial service sector jobs. Sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that's what an immigrant wants. Sometimes that's a dramatic improvement from what they had in the old country. But sometimes it's can be humiliating and can be disappointing for immigrants that perhaps had a very different idea of what Canada was and what the Canadian life had to offer. And you are sort of seeing a lot of stories, and you have seen a lot of stories during the Trudeau years of disappointed immigrants that are overqualified for jobs that they wind up getting in Canada, and then immigrants that wind up leaving Canada to go to the US or to go uh, back to their home country. And I think that's part of the Trudeau legacy as well. So, I mean, those are just a couple of issues that are kind of at the front of my mind. It's without going into foreign policy and lots of other things. But I do think that, Trudeau is a mixed bag, but I do kind of feel like he wasn't the most decisive leader. I kind of feel like a lot of these trends that sort of have defined the last 10 years of Canada represent kind of a broad, sort of consensus position that a lot of, sort of quote unquote elite Canadians were in favor of. I think that stuff relating to the immigration system, stuff relating to the indigenous sort of system, And then a kind of just kind of like blasé indifference about the challenges of the Canadian economy. Like, I don't think it's fair to pile all of those as being sort of just Trudeau's sort of like unique idiosyncrasies. I think that the mindset of the country in general and the mindset of sort of leaders across all domains in this country have been sort of in favor of that. And it's not obvious to me that, a different prime minister would have necessarily done things that much differently over the last decade or so.
Right. Like it's not entirely just because Trudeau is this emperor of like progressivism. Like it has to do a lot with the elite and the people around him that like
Yeah.
support him. Like he's not the progressive dictator that the people make him out to be sometimes.
No, and there's ways in which Trudeau has sort of continued tracks that we were on during the Harper years. I mean, Harper was the prime minister who apologized for the residential schools, for instance, and kind of got that kind of wheel a turning. Uh, you know, Harper was also hiked the immigration rate to record highs as well. Like that was part of his legacy too. So you could say that Harper is sort of an economist by training, cared much more about sort of financial matters than Trudeau ever did. But I think in a lot of ways you can say that that there was a kind of consensus as far as how Canada should deal with certain issues. It wasn't a really sort of challenge consensus. It was the so-called Laurentian consensus, if you've ever heard that term,
Right.
this kind of sense that there's kind of like, basically the opinions and sort of like the golden triangle of sort of privileged people in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto are generally the kind of agenda that drives, policy in this country. And I think that you could maybe make the argument that maybe Trudeau's tenure and its sort of incuriosity about challenging some of those kind of axioms uh, kind of brought us to the point where we are now, where that kind of consensus thinking feels very exhausted and is in need of a dramatic kind of course correction. But if we think of Trudeau as somebody who's not a sort of deep political thinker unto himself, then I think that it's worth arguing that maybe responsibility for some of the places that Canada has wound up should be broadly shared, not just among the Trudeau inner circle, not just even within his own party, but within sort of elite Canada in general.
Have you noticed a little bit of a certain like Harper nostalgia? I've noticed that in some articles or even just like random videos that have been popping up. Um, and I feel like that's like an administration that like a lot of people in my generation just know nothing about.
Yeah.
So could you tell me a little bit about what the incoming conservative administration might do that would actually differentiate themselves from like a Harper era? Like what are the reasons we like certain progressives are so like doomerish about the incoming Polyev era because they basically treat him like the return of Harper.
Yeah. I mean, I think that Polyev is more ideological than Harper, or at least more excited by the prospect of having a kind of, pretty orthodox conservative government in charge. Harper spent much of his political career being sort of demonized as this kind of demagogue or ideologue, someone who was too right wing for a supposedly inherently progressive country like Canada. And Harper, pardon me, had to play a lot of defense over the course of his political career in the lead up to getting elected prime minister to sort of suggest that he wasn't a radical. He wasn't in favor of dramatic reform. He was in favor of slow, what they sometimes called incremental kind of conservative reforms to the Canadian government and Canadian state. And, partially this was because Harper was somewhat boxed in by having two back to back minority administrations before he eventually got his first and only majority government in 2011. Whereas Polyev, and Harper also, he was a product of the founding of the Conservative Party of Canada in 2003, which was itself a kind of merger of the kind of the more progressive rump of the old Progressive Conservative Party, and then his more kind of like upstart Reform Alliance Party. So like Harper was a guy whose political career had been defined in large part by a kind of sense of the necessity of pragmatism. And I think that when you look at his, decade or so in office, it was also, cautious in a similar sort of way. Whereas Polyev, I think, is much more kind of unapologetically like, I'm gonna, kind of come in guns ablazing. We're gonna have a strong conservative government. We're gonna have a government that sort of hews very tightly and unapologetically to kind of old-fashioned conservative principles, in the sense that, we are going to make cuts. We are going to kind of go to war with the bureaucracy. We are going to sort of slash funding for irrelevant or wasteful things, such as the CBC, and that this is sort of like what Canada needs. Canada needs tax cuts. Canada needs dramatic sort of deregulation of various industries. You know, this is the this is, I think, what Pierre is animated by. I think he has always been a rather sort of pugilistic kind of character, a rather sort of ideological character, a character who believes that he has the answers to the big problems facing Canada, and those answers tend to take the form of, pretty orthodox kind of conservative philosophy in terms of small government, low taxes, uh, sort of skepticism of entrenched bureaucrats and academic elites, and more trust for a free market, and more trust for mostly unregulated business competition in realms of commerce, and this sort of thing. So, I mean, we live at a time in which there is been a lot of talk about, sort of populist conservatism as a kind of like new flavor of it, whether that's in, America or England or Europe or wherever. But I think that amid that, I think Pierre is very much a champion of the kind of orthodox Reagan, Thatcher, 80s, 90s kind of flavor of conservatism that has often been declared to be dead by people that are more sort of exhilarated by, populist people like Donald Trump, whose ideology seems much more ill-defined and ahistorical. Whereas I think that Canada will be, one of the uh, one of the 21st centuries, one of the 2020s sort of great case studies as to whether or not a more sort of orthodox approach to 20th century conservatism is still a useful governing philosophy in this day and age.
It's an interesting note um, to s- to say the biggest difference might be uh, how Harper came in with like a minority government versus the guns blazing of like
Yeah,
a majority government, and like it's basically like having the Senate and the House in the States, or like where you have like a 60-40 majority, where like you really do get
yes,
to do what you want. You really do get to greenlight a lot of projects and have your way with your political agenda without having to spend a lot of time like negotiating, say like with the NDP. Um,
yeah.
so
And I
that's
think it's also it's because it's important to sort of understand that one of the reasons why Harper only won a minority government, I think sort of the conventional wisdom of the time, was that, when Harper was first elected in 2006, there was a kind of thinking that, Canada was maybe not in perfect shape, but Canada was not in a moment of crisis, right? The sense was like the biggest sort of issue facing Canada in those days, at least in sort of the political realm, was accusations of corruption within the Liberal Party. Right. It was like the idea that, like, does Canada need a cleaner, more ethical government? And that's kind of very much how Harper sort of positioned himself. The Liberal Party at that time was in the midst of a really sort of terrible kind of essentially money laundering scandal, the so-called sponsorship scandal, which is now sort of long forgotten. But at the time, it felt like the biggest thing in the world. But at the same time, Harper's promise to sort of clean up Ottawa had to be balanced against a kind of general mood among the electorate that, I think Canada was in broadly good shape. Most sort of Canadian public policies were in sort of the right direction. The Prime Minister of the time, Prime Minister Harper, or Prime Minister Martin, was seen as a good economic manager, a good economic steward. So, Harper kind of got in begrudgingly and, sort of was cautiously elected by the Canadian people. And he, over time, built up that support where he could then, in turn, for his third go, finally get elected to the majority government. Whereas I think in 2025, there is much more of a sense that like Canada is in a state of crisis, an economic crisis now, and a diplomatic crisis. And as a result, it needs that kind of decisive leadership and that kind of dramatically different kind of course adjusting agenda that somebody like Polyev brings. So the two men are being sort of picked in different contexts. And I think their temperament sort of explains how their agenda is different. But also, I think that both men are very sort of acutely aware of where the public mood is and what the public wants. And I think Harper positioned himself for one public mood, and Pierre has positioned himself for a much different one.
Hmm. I think one of Trudeau's legacies will be not doing electoral reform when he had the chance. Because now I don't see it happening for a long time.
Mm.
Um, but I want to switch the subject a little bit to an idea I have for a future video on electoral reform that I feel passionately about. Um, and it's the JD Vance voting thing, actually, or family voting, or Demony voting,
Oh,
where
yeah.
you end up giving parents votes according to their children, and end up distributing them like half and half, um, or if you're really feminist, you can just give them to the mother. I kind of want to ask you about your thoughts on that, because I know you've been like kind of a little bit skeptical of like electoral reform before, but
Yeah.
basically how JD Vance brought it up was, I think, a little bit um, too punitive for like the tastes of both conservative and liberal media, frankly. Um, but I just want to bring this up because I think it's interesting. I was looking back, and um, Krista Freeland actually had written an article in 2013 about how she thought family voting was actually a potential idea to combat like gerontocracy and like income inequality just by enfranchising like children. So I want to see if you've ever thought about this.
I mean, my general principle is that, politicians are not to be trusted with altering the rules of, the game that they themselves have to play and, live or die by, right? Our current electoral system is flawed in all sorts of ways. Like it's very easy to make a kind of like abstract academic argument against it. But on the other hand, it's also just something that we've inherited, right? No politician living today made up that system. It's sort of something that's been handed down from the generations. And as a result, we all kind of learn how to play within those rules, and all political parties have been able to get elected under those rules. Whereas you contrast that with introducing some sort of new system, and that will be made by politicians who are currently in office, politicians who are very partisan, politicians who have a vested interest in seeing themselves or other parties to their liking get elected over other parties that they don't care for. So I don't know, like when JD Vance says it, I think it's pretty obvious that someone as partisan as him is sort of proposing this idea in the context that, conservatives have big families and, we're the family kind of constituency. And therefore, if there's any sort of electoral system that is introduced that sort of incentivizes big families or, just people that have children in general, that's a system that's likely to benefit conservatives. And so, in that sense, I don't think that he's making a sort of purely kind of like, normative assessment of, what a good electoral
Yeah,
system
I for
should
sure
be.
agree. Like, I think he's
Yeah.
coming at it from like a partisan perspective, but I think the interesting note is that I don't believe it's actually that beneficial for either part. Like the differences in the proportion of like people have families um, isn't
Yeah.
actually that different between conservatives and liberals, because as the income gap grows, like it tends to just be um, richer, more well off, like young adults that are like currently like having families. Um,
Yeah.
so and also I think like in the video I plan to mostly make the argument based on just the principles. I think regardless of like the outcome, just because even if um like say the JD Vance voting policy is like somehow able to get passed, I don't think I don't think it's a good argument against it that like if family voting passes and then like conservatives get elected, um like I basically see that as like just like results based analysis, where like if your party is good enough to be able to capture the votes of like the young adults, of like the forward looking people in the nation, then I basically think that party like deserves to win, basically.
Yeah,
um and it has my contention has less to do with the results, and more to do with the effect I think it would have on the parties and politicians, because I think opening up like that new like it would be like 20-25% of voting population, basically. It, it would it would do well to moderate basically both parties and politicians, um, either in the US or Canada. This could be like implemented and act as basically a hedge against the gerontocracy, or the people that are more enfranchised, that have more political power and like are able to vote and like make their voices heard, as opposed to the children that are going to be in the system for longer, but and they get counted in the population already. So like we already account them for when we're doing the tabulation of seats, or like I think it's
yeah,
every 10 years in Canada, like we do the census. So it's not like we don't account for children
yeah,
already. It's just we don't actually take any effort to like represent them. So I think
yeah.
that's how I plan to make the argument.
No, I mean it's fair. I mean, people can make these arguments again. Like you can make the arguments on principle. I just think that in the world that we inhabit, unless you can kind of get a broad kind of like bipartisan coalition in favor of sort of fundamental changes to our voting regime, I just tend to be pretty skeptical of them. Because otherwise I just kind of feel like you're having this conversation as a sort of philosophical one, and that's fine. But I do kind of think that in, again, like the polarized world that we inhabit, it's just kind of difficult for reform proposals to get perceived as anything other than a sort of power grab. It's not to sort of say that it's impossible to do that, but I definitely kind of think that when you want to start having these kinds of conversations, merely trying to make a persuasive argument isn't good enough. I think that these arguments have to, arguments as dramatic as these have to begin from a place where it's like, look, we have taken this clearly out of the realm of partisanship. This is an argument that is being made by people on the right and the left, kind of linking arms in solidarity, kind of both sort of agreeing and speaking with one voice that this is in the interest of the country as a whole. And I just kind of think that until you get to that point, even the most well thought out proposal is going to be regarded with a great deal of partisan skepticism from one side or the other. And then that will sort of trickle to the politicians, who will then either be very open minded or very closed minded about this sort of proposal, because they'll be doing all of the tabulations from their own sort of self-interested perspective. So again, like I don't think it's impossible to win people over to these kinds of reform proposals, but I just think that anybody making them really kind of has to think of it from a a position of sort of bipartisan marketing, because I think unless it is marketed aggressively as a bipartisan sort of neutral good of the country kind of thing by people that have credibility to both sides, it's probably not going to go anywhere beyond just being something that's fun to talk about.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it's just kind of like my dark horse pick for what could potentially be like bipartisan. My theory of the case behind this is basically, um, I feel like it's a unique opportunity for the Democrats to get behind this kind of policy, because I think the Trump administration will be so uniquely incompetent at governing that it appeals to their natural conservative tendencies and their families, and the value of like the structure of family and enfranchising children, and basically, because think of like the kinds of policies that like appeal to like the young adults or young parents, which is like um, things like, for example, like the child tax credit in Canada, and like
Yeah,
safe streets, safe neighborhoods, early childhood education, and like public school funding, or even private school funding. Um, so I think it's like Vance will propose it when like they're strong earlier on, and then I think like come like midterms, or like certain like scandals, or um, just like with the deportation camps, or just like ineffective and frankly like vindictive policies. I think that it's a unique opportunity that the Democrats take advantage of like that incompetency, but have like bipartisan support for this kind of thing, and the midterms for 2028. It would be interesting at least. But I
Mhm.
agree, it's not super useful to have these philosophical conversations if they don't have like underlying ground support or politicians that are willing to speak about it.
Yeah, bipartisan, I would say, especially.
Yeah. So we're waiting for the Democratic JD Vance, I guess. Which, yeah.
It's funny, like, I remember, I forget what it was. I forget if it was like specifically about a carbon tax. It might have been, but like there was like an ad, a sort of notorious ad where you had Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich, the former Republican leader, and they were sitting on a couch together, and they were sort of saying like, we may not agree on much, but when it comes to the environment, blah 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 blah, and they were proposing some policy or another, carbon pricing or something like that, and they imagined it like this is a great sort of bipartisan gesture. Look at how we're sort of, putting partisanship aside. We're literally sitting on a couch together. But then, that became, I mean, this is again a sort of testament to the polarized times. That became sort of perceived not as a heroic display of bipartisanship, but like, why the hell are you sitting on a couch with that guy? Why the hell are you guys working together? Don't you realize that they're bad? Like, why are you not fighting the good fight and this kind of thing? So I don't know. It's like, it's so hard to imagine sort of the situation getting to a point where you could actually have a broad bipartisan consensus where you could have, Fox News saying this is good and MSNBC saying it's good and the politicians on both sides and the president and the Congress and all these sort of people, all of the intellectuals on both sides, right? Like to mobilize that kind of like broad support for something just feels like really beyond our capacity in this kind of like modern world. And I feel like that being the case, you know, it just invites, I think, a certain kind of modesty and scaled back ambition when it comes to what is realistically likely to be achieved legislatively in the current decade. It's not to say that maybe we won't get to an era of good feelings sometime in the future in which kind of more ambitious ideas might be possible. But as it stands now, I think the most logical sort of policy wins to fathom are ones that are likely to be divisive and unpopular with at least half the population, and that's fine. There's still a lot you can do that half the population won't want, but I definitely think it's the kind of thing that has to be in much more conventional realms of policy making as opposed to kind of like existential sort of structural change.
As for conventional forms of policymaking, how do you feel about getting annexed? Are you excited for the integration?
I mean, you see all of this sort of conversation about it in the press where it's like, is Trump serious? Should we take Trump seriously? And it's like, I think Trump is serious in the same way he was like serious about building the wall on the Mexican border and having the Mexicans pay for it, right? It's like Trump can believe something very earnestly and sort of convince himself that this is a priority and that he cares a great deal about seeing it to fruition. But I think there's a lot of reason to believe that Trump is pretty weak when it comes to the follow through and loses interest in things rather quickly, and some new thing will catch his eye. I mean, it's kind of hard to avoid the impression that I think on some level Trump is just a little bit bored waiting to be inaugurated, and so as he's sitting down there in Mar-a-Lago, he can come up with all sorts of fun ideas. Then, but eventually he'll be back in the Oval Office, and the president doesn't really get to sort of pick and choose his own agenda. The president is very much sort of kind of kept adrift in the heaving seas of current affairs. So yeah,
Yeah.
I have a feeling that by the time Trump actually is president, this is not something that we're going to be seeing nearly as many memes about.
It reminds me a little bit of like the locker up stuff, right? Like he seemed very unconcerned with that
Yeah,
as soon as he got like elected. It's just like forgotten. But
yeah,
it is funny to
that's a great
imagine
example. Yeah,
the build the wall thing, because um, it's like he's at the stage where it's like he's picking like tiles for like the kitchen, right? Where you just like pick the color of the
yeah,
wall and like pick like the spikes or whatever. So I want to draw the analogy to like how is he gonna like pick the tile for like which can what how is he gonna symbolically invade Canada is what I'm saying. Like what stage? Like
yeah.
is he gonna put a couple snipers on like the border walls, or um I don't know.
No, it's a
Imagine what
good,
it's
like,
gonna
I
be.
mean, it's It's in some ways it's like a good question to ask, right? Jonathan V. Last, on the Bulwark, I quite like his commentary, and one of the sort of things that he has been sort of saying about Trump is that like it's fine, like you can take Trump seriously, but if you take him seriously, that doesn't just mean you tear your hair out and go like, oh my God, what a crazy idea. You can actually like call his bluff and be like, okay, Mr. President, so how is the annex Greenland thing going? Like, have you
Yeah.
made any phone calls? Are you talking? Like, where's the meetings? Like, where is this? Like, you said it's a big priority, so like, where are we? What have you done? Have all you done is sent out a dopey meme on Truth Social? Because that's not going to do it. Like, you got to do a little bit more than that. But it's like the fact that he is clearly so disinterested in the follow through. It's kind of like a classic example of how when it comes to big projects in life, sort of people will often tell you that
Yeah,
one of the
exactly.
worst things you can do is just talk about your ideas all the time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure,
Like,
for sure.
because it gives you the same kind of dopamine squirt as you would get if you'd actually done it, right? Because people will say, oh, they'll give you the reaction that you're looking for. It's like if you say, like, I'm going to get into really good shape this year. And it's like, oh, that's how good for you, Kevin. We're so proud and happy and this kind of thing. And then you don't actually have to do it. And you've kind of already had the fantasy about how cool you're going to look and all the rest of it. And so then you get lazy because you've already kind of gotten the stimulus from it.
Exactly, I would say, and I think we're doing a good thing by doing the memes because we're giving Trump as much dopamine as possible. By he gets to see the map of like red Canada,
Yeah,
red Greenland, and whatever, and he'll get the
yeah, yeah,
dopamine from it. But he gets the success of invading and winning over Canada without ever doing it, which is
yeah,
great for
yeah,
us.
precisely. So maybe I mean
Hopefully,
like that's
hopefully we can give him some dopamine about tariffs and just to
yeah.
I don't know, like just funnel money into his bank account or something to like make number go up, and then he'll forget about the tariffs. Like we got to think of some
Yeah,
psychological warfare.
yeah, we need some pro tariff memes. Maybe somebody just make like an AI generated picture of him sitting on a giant throne of gold and money floating down, and just be like, America under tariffs, and then it's just like, okay, we did it. Because it's like that's the thing, like with the wall. Like I think that like in Trump's mind, I think that he probably imagines that the wall actually was made. Like that this was actually something that happened, and that's kind of like why he doesn't talk about it anymore, because I guess he's just been sort of flattered into believing that anything that Trump wants, Trump gets. So if he wanted it badly enough, it must have happened in some form. So,
Yeah, you have
but
to think
yeah,
the
I don't
picture
know.
of the wall is the same as the wall. So how can we
Yeah,
create a
yeah,
convincing enough picture of tariffs to make him believe that the
yes,
tariffs happened? That's a
yes,
problem
yes.
we're gonna have to address somehow.
Tariffs is weird because it really sort of seems like tariffs just really seem like something that no one really cares about, right? Like that, like the annex the world kind of thing. Like you can understand how that sort of panders to a kind of sort of chauvinistic kind of latent imperial lust that a lot of sort of young men, let's say, have when they're playing Risk or whatever, right? Like there's a kind of natural kind of like instinct that you can imagine, like growing the country in this kind of simple way. But like a tariff is just such a weird like idea from yesteryear that has never been a part of mainstream conservatism, has never been part of mainstream economics in any form. It's just like a really weird idea that Trump has dug up out of the grave of discredited ideas and is trying to like will back into existence through sheer force of insistence. And even like when you look at the most sort of like dogmatic, right wing ideologues, like they're not like rah tariff, except to the degree that it's something that Trump says is important. So they have to play defense for everything that Trump wants. But like, if you were like looking at, I don't know, Breitbart or Tucker Carlson or whatever, like since when have tariffs ever been a big part of their worldview? They haven't. It's just really something that Trump wants. And, modern conservatism is just kind of backwards in the sense that like what Trump wants has to be rationalized rather than this was a rational thing to begin with. And, Trump is just an avatar for carrying it out.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my favorite terms that I've picked up from the book on freedom by Timothy Snyder, one of my favorite authors right now, and it's sadopopulism, which is
Yes.
basically just the slogan of the Trump administration, where he's not particularly concerned with economic growth or distribution towards like the working class or like protecting unions or anything. Like it is about owning the libs and the and the tears of China and Canadians and any country unlucky enough to like
Yeah.
having tariffs imposed on. And it doesn't help anyone. But I think we have to realize at some point that that's actually kind of the point. And I think and conservatives will like bend over backwards to post hoc justify anything he does, so long as it makes a lot of Guardian and New York Times and like all those kinds of reporters like really angry, and they get a lot of like headlines about it, and a lot of tweets
Yeah.
about it are just about how ineffective and crappy policy it is. But that increasingly that just seems to be the point.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is sort of performative politics. And I mean, like that can be good and bad, I suppose. It's bad in the sense that these are like bad ideas that, we don't benefit from sort of having mainstreamed. It's good in the sense that if it never goes beyond just sort of saying dumb things, then, there's an opportunity cost that's sort of wasted that could be better spent on politicians proposing serious ideas. But if these ideas are just, yeah, like we said before, like if they never really rise beyond the level of sort of memes and news cycles and outrage and jokes and all that, then maybe we could do a lot worse. There's always this, it's interesting because there's always this kind of fear of like the competent demagogue. Like people sometimes say, oh, like, if Tucker Carlson became president, that would be scary because he's like the competent demagogue. But
Or
I think
Steve
that
Bannon,
part
right?
of, or Steve Bannon or whatever, but it's like part of the appeal of populism and demagogues has always been that it's a little dumb, right? That like you have to be a kind of somewhat dopey person who just doesn't care if the policies are well thought out or if they work or if they're practical or realistic. He just kind of like has an ability to just kind of, quote unquote, say what we're all thinking and just kind of like spray out these ideas in a way that's very emotionally resonant and gets people sort of riled up and excited. And I think that once you have somebody who is at all sort of grounded in reality, then their instincts of what is real and what is practical and what is achievable sort of start to kick in. And that has a sort of censorious kind of sort of consequence. And then as a result, you get a much more sort of like watered down version of populism, which is why I think that all of these people, whether they're Tucker or Bannon or JD Vance or whoever, fundamentally what they want to be is like yes man. They want to be the people carrying the bully's coat, as they say. They want to be the people saying like, oh yeah, you're so right, let me try to come up with a way that I can rationalize and defend your crazy policy and make it work and tell everybody why it's actually good and cheer you on and all of that. But they're not people that have that natural sort of talent for just kind of saying crazy shit out of nowhere.
Yeah, they don't have the political instincts like Trump does, and that is something I've
Yeah,
been just hearing more and more. Is that I don't like it that when people say like Trump is like tricking his base, because I don't believe that to be the case at all. Like
no,
he is the manifestation of his base, and he is the dopey populist that doesn't have a very sophisticated or curious interest in like the world or like any of the ideas or like ideologies. Like it is ultimately all just a narcissistic experiment to see like which kinds of things that you can say to like gather attention or gather like sympathy or like pity or whatever.
yeah, yeah. And I think this is always the case with populists. I think you look at all the great sort of demagogues of present and past, and they always kind of have a little bit of the screw loose. Like they're always a little bit untethered to reality. They're always quite ignorant and, self-aggrandizing and suffer from, what do you call it, that principle where it's like the less you know, the more confident you are when you're, is it the Dunning-Kruger effect or
Dunning
something
and
like that?
Kruger, yeah.
It's sort of like, yeah, like the less you know, the more confident you are sort of speaking out about the topic, right? Like that seems to be the characteristic of the successful populist politician. And like it's just very rare that you see, like, it's the case with the fellow in Argentina. Like he seems like, he's got a little bit flaky over there, and same with these like European demagogues that we always see. And certainly some of these other caudillo strongmen in Latin America, Hugo Chavez and all of that kind of set. Like they're always just a little untethered to the real world. But a lot of actual voters are kind of untethered to the real world, or at least are quite ignorant and have like a weird hodgepodge of ideas and beliefs and wants that are not practical or realistic or are informed by, conspiracy theorists and kind of like smatterings of facts that they kind of half remember that they heard on the radio like 40 years ago or whatever. Like that's why populism works, because a lot of people are that way. And populism kind of like upends the way that democratic politics traditionally works, and I would argue has been sort of structured to work, which is a principle of deference, and that there's supposed to be some degree of deference to your elected leader. That's kind of like what a sort of small r Republican system of government is supposed to be, that there's this kind of like middle tier of politicians who are wiser than you are, but you trust them to make the good decisions. Whereas populism is like, we shall elect someone who is just as smart as I am, whose biases and ignorance is equal to my own, and that will somehow create a more just government. But I don't think it does.
Yeah, he says what I'm afraid to say, or what we're already
Yeah, yeah,
thinking.
yeah.
On that note, I want to talk a little bit about your recommendation of the year for 2024 that I picked up, Hitler's
Oh,
People,
yeah. Oh, nice.
and
Good book.
I haven't made my way entirely through it, but I have like the way it's formatted, like it's all um, like it's easy enough to jump from biography to like the last biography in the book, and it's been
Yeah,
helpful
yeah,
for me. But I want to talk a little bit about, or I want to ask you a little bit about why you think that this is a important piece to become culturally literate, as you said in your
yeah,
video. And
yeah,
yeah, sorry, that's it.
yeah. Yeah. No, no. So like that was my end of the year recommendation book, Hitler's People by Richard J. Evans. Richard J. Evans is, one of the top historians of the Third Reich. He's an old man. He's been writing for many, many years. He's written many books about the Nazi government. And Hitler's People is, I guess, sort of the culmination of his career to date. It's a sort of very readable, very accessible. Uh, I don't want to sort of use too frivolous adjectives when talking about Nazis, but in some ways it is kind of like a breezy read. It's very well written, very confidently written, and in some ways quite casually written. And he just kind of like summarizes, broadly speaking, the biographies of the leading sort of figures in Hitler's government and the Nazi movement more broadly. And he kind of gives you a sense of who they were as people, where they came from. What their background was, how they rose to power, what they did in power, what their sort of reputation and legacy has been. And Richard J. Evans, sprinkles his own sort of analysis in there as well, as somebody who has studied, the Nazis for decades. And I really like books like this. I like books that are readable. I like books that are, presented in a very digestible fashion. All of our attention spans have, in some ways, been sort of ruined by the internet. I think most of us have a harder time sort of staying focused when it comes to sort of cracking open a big, thick book and just wading through chapter after chapter. So I think that the way that the book is formatted, the fact that it is just like these little biographies that you can just kind of like pick and choose which ones you read, you can skip around. I think that that's a very sort of savvy way of formatting a book. For a 21st century audience. And I found it to be very readable. And it was also just because you can kind of skip around, it's also a good way that you can sort of fill in the gaps of your own cultural knowledge. Like you can sort of think like Albert Speer. It's like, oh, do I know who that guy was? I know who Goring was. I know who Goebbels was. I know who Himmler was. But Speer is somebody who I don't really know as much about. So maybe I'll just read that chapter first. And, and that was my experience. Like there were certain Nazis that I knew less about, and I was kind of more eager to kind of get up to speed on who they are. And now I feel more culturally confident. I can talk about who Rudolf Hess is and that kind of stuff in a way that maybe I couldn't before. So if anybody is like interested in becoming more fluent in Nazis, which I think grim as it may sound, I do think everybody should know this kind of stuff. And yeah, and I think you can't get a much better introductory guide or supplementary guide than this one. So that's my commercial for
Yeah,
Hitler's People.
good sponsorship. Um, I want to tell you a little bit my impression of the first chapter I jumped to, which is the mother, Gertrude Schultz Klink, and it
Mm,
was basically just because you just never hear that much in like common discourse about like the women of Germany, and and how they contributed or didn't contribute towards like the war efforts, and what was going
mm,
on in the homes. What did the wives do? How did they support their husbands through the war effort, basically? And um, sort of a theme throughout the book that I've noticed so far is is the conceptualization of these people's home lives, and how a lot of them were frankly very well off, middle class, but they they lived lives that are honestly relatively similar to how we how we do now. And it's just like the
yeah,
little anecdotes about like how they like play instruments, and how like they do
yeah,
like poetry and like things like that, like a lot of those in the biographies. I I've been using the word humanize too much, but I think what it does for me at least is, and kind of why I picked up the book basically, is I want to know why authoritarianism is so attractive, and how, and you know, the ideas and precedents that like come before it, and how to make like the case for democracy, basically. Like that's my
mm,
that's my channel banner, democracy enjoyer. But to be frank,
mm,
I'm a psychology major. Like I've never really done this much on like historical reading before. Like it mostly just become comes from, like, I had in my first video too, that like I just think we've like always taken, not always, but recently in this kind of discourse, we've taken democracy for granted. And if someone like pushes you in a long form interview, say for like 2 hours or whatever, on like what democracy is, I think just a lot of people would
yeah,
really struggle to like get past like the first like two sentences or something. So that's kind of something I want to get better at, is having a better concept of like democracy and freedom, and like positive freedoms, like
mm,
what is the kind of conceptualization of the good society that we can build, and how can we avoid resentful inferiority complexes among like the
mm,
among like the middle class, that like lead to like a
yeah,
lot of the endorsements of like authoritarianism. Like that's what I
mm,
noticed through this book so far, is how like a lot of these events of a lot of the traumatic events in these people's lives leaves them, um like mostly like World War I, or like the death of their children or husband, or even just like the degradation of their of their social life, and like they started eating, like they ate less well and had like less calories. And
yeah.
that that's my impression, is just how easy it is to like kind of make that jump. And I don't think a lot of kids around my age like necessarily appreciate how good we kind of have it in our current like information landscape, and how easy it is to kind of become resentful, or like so easily like swayed and like radicalized, that something like this
Mm.
can something like the Holocaust can happen without you knowing or like lifting a finger.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we are kind of like dimly aware because when we think of I agree with sort of how you've sort of summarized the book and the characters in it. Yeah, they are sort of broadly just they're all basically like middle class people of varying stratas within that tier of sort of society, and but they all do like the process that you're describing is that they all kind of have a radicalizing moment, right? Like they all get radicalized in some form or another. Some of them were kind of already pretty right wing people that just became more and more extreme over time. But, some of them were kind of more politically kind of like curious. And then they ultimately threw in their lot with the Nazis and all that. And you're right that like oftentimes the inciting event was some sort of personal trauma, real or imagined. A lot of it was, I think a response to a dislike of the left, and I think that that is something that certainly seems very familiar in today's world, like a hatred of communists, a hatred of socialists, this kind of sense that the left, broadly understood, is the root of all that's wicked and bad in the world, and that any price is high enough to pay if it means sort of stamping out the left. So that's pretty familiar. But I do think that we all are kind of aware of the threat of radicalization and the idea that that the resentments of middle class people, especially sort of young middle class men, can be seized upon and can be exploited in order to steer those men towards paths of political extremism. You know, Not exclusively on the right, but that does seem to be the more sort of common manifestation of it. And, that's why I think people like you and me aspire to do what we're doing, is to present sort of, some sort of de radicalizing influence in the context of a media climate that is full of people that are very happy and eager to see people get more and more radicalized. The Nazis were often radicalized by their circumstances and were radicalized by Hitler himself and the propaganda of the Nazi Party and other sort of far right movements of the time. But the Nazis and the Germans of the 20s and 30s, they didn't live in the world that we live in today, where you have mass media, where you have a million YouTube channels and TikToks and social media accounts and television stations and all of this kind of stuff. So in many ways, like we live in a even more frightening period of time in terms of at least the risks of radicalization. And then you kind of have to like think, what is anybody doing to sort of curb the possibility that we could be going down a similar path? Because it does sort of seem like once you hit some sort of critical mass of radicalization, and I think the book does a good job of sort of suggesting that, is that the whole sort of democratic system can be unwound very, very quickly. One of the biographies that I found very interesting in the book, I don't know if you read it, was Franz von Papen. He was the chancellor of Germany before Hitler, and he was like this kind of like aristocratic sort of conservative. And then he ultimately just sided with the Nazis, like he and sort of people in his party kind of conspired to make Hitler the new chancellor because they were like, well, he's more extreme than we are, but, conservative, right wing, it's all basically the same. This government kind of
Yeah,
sucks anyway. Democracy is
they basically thought he
overrated.
could
So,
be a
like,
vessel for power.
yeah, and it's just like, and because ultimately, like the issue was like, well, we all hate the same people, and that's basically the most important thing. And like, we'll sacrifice a lot along the path to hate, basically, and that includes democracy and normal political institutions, a depoliticized military, all of the other things about sort of the German democratic system that Hitler sort of very quickly uh, sort of deconstructed and then made into tools of his own sort of fascist government. So yeah, I mean the institutions of civilization are very fragile, and in many ways they're just kind of a collective fiction that is upheld by all of our sort of collective desire to play along with them. And the minute you sort of stop deciding to care about these things, the minute you stop deciding to care about, democracy or the Constitution or courts or whatever else, like these things can fall very quickly because they're creations of man. They're not physical things that exist in the real world. They're things that exist because we all agree to play by them, right? And the moment you sort of say, no, we're going to play a different game, well, that's often good enough.
Can I ask you a little bit about like foreign interference and the role you think it plays in like destabilizing like democracy and or like our
Mm,
information sphere?
yeah. I mean, I think it's a serious concern, although I do sort of think that, like, when we think of foreign interference, like foreign interference works to the extent that it elevates aspects of our
That are
society that
already there.
already are
Yeah, yeah.
present, right? And that's always been the case, right? Like, and like you can even sort of say, like this is sort of maybe this is not the most flattering of analogies, but like when I was younger, I really pushed back against kind of like anti-American kind of like rhetoric as it existed, like say on the college campus and all of this kind of stuff. In the aftermath of 9/11, weirdly enough, there was a real uptick in anti-Americanism. And one of the things that the anti-Americans would often say is that it's like, oh, America meddles in all of these foreign countries and, they overthrow the governments and blah, blah, blah. They bring this guy to power, this dictator or whatever. Oftentimes, these were like very anti-communist dictators that were, assisted by the CIA in some fashion. But like one of the arguments that I would make is that, like, these people don't exist in a vacuum. Like America or the CIA or whatever cannot wave a magic wand and then suddenly there's like some anti-communist demagogue that just exists in that country and then rises to power. It's like to the extent that America was meddling in countries in those days, which it was often to support kind of currents and factions of the culture that already existed that, maybe the American government of the time saw as being allied with American interests. And that's basically the sort of same thing that we're seeing now. I mean, I think in a much more sort of sinister and nefarious way. But the principle is the same, is that, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or whatever, they're looking at existing divisions and polarizations in our current society and trying to feed into the ones that they think are in their interests to see rise in influence and power. What makes this kind of like uniquely sort of upsetting is I think that in America, especially, there is just such an already existing powerful current of anti American sort of sentiment, of self loathing sentiment in the US, of people that want to see America fail, of people that, Americans that want to see Americans fail and that don't like American institutions and want to sort of see their society collapse or, fall into civil war or whatever. And it's sort of distressing that these people then all but invite foreign interference because they are so self-loathing. I mean, and like you could say that that's different than like American support of, authoritarianism or whatever. Is that you have people that are all but openly eager to receive foreign support and will play defense for odious foreign regimes. The fact that the American conservative movement is as apologetic as it is towards Putin's Russia and sort of the authoritarian regime in Hungary, to the point where they'll CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, will actually go to Hungary and stage their meeting there and praise Viktor Orban's government as somehow being like better than America. Like it's really quite like grotesque and terrifying that to use the old chestnut, they're really not even hiding it anymore. There's a substantial faction of Americans who are all but happy to openly champion being, if not necessarily agents of foreign interference, of certainly active allies of governments that are as anti-American as they themselves.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning that these things like used to be like black marks on like a politician, but now it's like their character endorsements from like Trump used like Orban
Yeah,
and like Putin as his character references basically,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
that is
absolutely.
so it's crazy to see what goes for that on a presidential application. So, um,
Yeah,
but
yeah, it's bonkers.
you know, um, what's my next question? I do have a bone to pick with you.
Oh,
That I want to talk about your conservative temperament and reluctance to endorse my friend Poker Night because I want to basically just make the case for it on on the socialization aspect, and this is something
hmm
we're definitely concerned about is the atomization of young men and young women, and just like the number of like reported friends basically, and basically there are some stats that I want to ask you about that are
yeah,
that some people can actually like conceptualize as like good or bad, which is like so we've like super increased like crypto gambling and all that, and like the credit default, which is bad. But I want to focus on like specifically like young people like drinking less and like having like sex less, um
yes,
and like reporting like fewer like close friends or like relationships. um and I know like the poker doesn't necessarily have to deal with that, but like it's kind of like a representation of like things that occur less basically, we don't drink as much, like less like social lubricant, and as much
mm,
as I personally like don't like bars or like drinking, like I do kind of feel a sadness over the death of some of our third places.
yeah, yeah. So you are sore because I was making fun of you for having your
A
poker
little
night the
bit.
other day.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I
Yeah,
couldn't tell you whether or not you were serious or not because it was like over text or whatever. So I just wanted to hash it
yeah.
out a little bit or hear more of your
Well,
thoughts.
it's like, yeah, I mean, so like I've never been a drinker and I've never had alcohol in my life and I'm proud of it, right? And the thing is that when you're a non-drinker, people are often quite sort of threatened and confused by this, and they often sort of believe that they're owed an explanation as to why you're not drinking. And I often sort of say that I don't think I owe anybody an explanation. They owe me a persuasive case as to why I should drink. Whenever I sort of frame things that way, they always kind of say, well, it's like, well, it's good for socializing and blah, 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 blah. And I don't know. I guess it's just like alcohol is just very objectively bad for you. Um, and it's just hard for me to believe as somebody who has lived a life in the opposite way, and I think has lots of friends and healthy social life and all the rest of it. I just feel like I want to see us as a society get away from this idea that socializing requires like substances, that socializing should either sort of use substances in order to make the activity itself enjoyable, or that the only sort of activity that a social event can be organized around is the consumption of substances. And just both of those things I just think are bad, because you're tying kind of like self-destructive behavior to something that should be sort of socially uplifting behavior. And I just kind of feel like that sends like a weird conflicting message, because then when it comes time to sort of divorce yourself from the toxic substances that you're ingesting, it becomes that much harder to do because you've linked it in your mind to something that's very pleasurable, which is hanging out with your friends and all of that. So I just I think that drinking is something that people get into in a kind of passive way. It's something that quote unquote everybody does, so I better do it too. But I think it's important to remember that we have agency in our lives and that we don't have to do the things that everybody else does. We can make different decisions, and the consequence for making a decision off different decision will often be much less dramatic than you've kind of been led to believe. Like, have I missed out on opportunities because I'm not drinking? Like, probably. But I think as a whole, I've been more like the drinkers than not in terms of how my life has gone, and the opportunities that I've had. But then I'd say my life is probably superior to drinkers in a lot of ways as well, in the sense that I think I'm a much healthier person at the age of 40 than I think a lot of people my age often are, who have been, drinking pretty, routinely since they were teenagers.
That's true. I do understand that like a large portion of it can be like a crutch, and I sympathize with um the you didn't frame it this way, but I'll put it stronger. Is like the disgust and like um in associating like the toxic substance with like the positive friendship, because like you're not
Mm,
really so much like developing like positive skills or like relationships. Like you sometimes might be using it as almost like an excuse to drink, or just like an excuse to go out and like
yeah.
distract from like other more important areas of your life that you're disappointed about. um but on that note, I want to ask you a little bit about like what kinds of imagination, what kinds of alternatives you would propose. But like, and I think a decent question for this is like, if you had I don't know, like a sufficient amount of money, an unlimited sum, like what kind
Mm.
of third places or gathering places do you think you would build in like society for like a government?
Well, who was the guy that wrote the Bowling Alone book? Do you know that?
Uh, Robert
What is his
Putnam, I
name?
think.
Robert Putnam, right? So like he did a
Yeah,
really good
I like
interview recently for the New York I think it was for the New York Times, right? And he said something that I thought was like quite profound, which, and even though it seems sort of self-evident, which is that, third places, these activities for sort of socializing and thickening the bonds with your fellow man, first and foremost, it has to be something that you want to do. It has to be something pleasurable and fun and something that you're intrinsically motivated to participate in. He was saying that, like, too often, when we read articles and hear from people talking about the sort of the phenomenon of loneliness and alienation and so forth, too often these kind of pieces often have a sort of hectoring tone, where it's like, you should do this, you should go to that, it's bad that we don't have these things anymore, and more people should be going to church or the community center or the lawn bowling society or whatever. And they have this sort of preachy tone that just kind of takes it for granted that the spaces are what matters. And maybe the spaces do matter, but what also matters is the vibes of those spaces and the people within them. And you want people to have good vibes, you want people to be happy and positive and excited to spend time with each other and to spend time doing something collectively together. So I think that this is the kind of situation where it cannot be just decreed from on high. We cannot just kind of say, like, people should congregate here and do this. No, it's like individuals themselves have to realize what is important to them, and then they have to make the initiative to seek out like-minded people who care about the same things that they do. And then from there, you start going through the business of sort of creating community spaces. So it's not just about making the space first and hoping people will show up or hectoring people to show up. It's about making a pre-existing connection with people on the basis of something that you have in common and something that you like and want to do more of, and that the enjoyment of that thing would be, accentuated with the presence of another, fan or enjoyer. So I think that that's the way that we have to think about it. So it's like, for some people that might be music, for some people that might be art, for some people that might be, I don't know, a video game or, some other hobby or sport or physical activity or whatever. Like we all are interested in different things. We're all animated by different passions. But the important thing is that you sort of you trust your passion, you trust your ability to enjoy something, you value your ability to enjoy something, and that you're motivated by a desire to keep that joy going and to share that joy with somebody else. Not, community building, community spaces, all this kind of thing. It shouldn't be like Brussels sprouts that you have to choke down between tears in order to do something that's good for me, right? It should be something that is very clearly something that matters to you and something that you would do on your own and you would do with people, something that you just matters to you. It's part of your identity as a person, and it's an identity that you want to share with other people.
I can understand that, but still, you don't think there's like a role for government to play in incentivizing this kind of behavior? Because, like, I I can understand the need for community involvement and like building from the ground up, but like I think it's hard to sometimes like start from ground zero if you're, especially if you have like the kind of a debt proportion that like Canada's use does, like when they're like largely kind of pretty impoverished with like rent
Mm,
prices or like paying like student loans, like it can be really difficult for them to like kind of allocate funds towards things like like rock climbing gym memberships or like to like pay for like music lessons
yeah.
or something like that. So
Yeah, but I mean, like, if people are into rock climbing, presumably they're already climbing rocks, right? So, like, there must be somewhere where they're doing that. Just next time you go to do it, bring your friend with you, right? I feel like, whereas if it's government just like creating a rock climbing gym out of nowhere and just saying, hey, look, we built this thing, kids, come and go hang out on it. Decide that you like rock climbing now and try to hang out with other people. Like, I don't know. I guess I'm not saying like that approach could never work. I'm just more skeptical of that approach working than a sort of organic demand based approach rather than a supply based approach.
okay, that's fair. What are your favorite third places to go to?
Right now, I spend a lot of time here, although I guess this is more like my work. This is the studio where me and some YouTubers here in Vancouver kind of pooled our resources and rented this studio where we can all hang out during the day and work on our YouTube videos. Although I guess that's not really a third place because
Yeah,
we're
that's
working
fair.
and this is our livelihood. But I don't know. I like going to restaurants a lot. Like that's probably one of my favorite things to do with my friends. I love eating out together. I feel like conversations, having over dinner, having over the activity of sharing a meal is a very sort of meaningful one. It friends introduce you to new restaurants, and if you enjoy food and all that, that can be a sort of a fun way to broaden your horizons and deepen your relationships with people. Um, that's probably my biggest one. I mean, like I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. Sometimes I wish I did have more third places in my life. I tend to, as I've gotten older, I tend to do a lot more sort of just one-on-one relationships with people, not really sort of congregating with people in groups as much as I did when I was younger. When I was younger, a lot of my social life revolved around being in college, like you, and so there's like a lot of spaces on the college campus that are very well suited to hanging out, and there's like projects that colleges present for young people that have inklings towards one thing or another, whether that's, being part of a college sports team, or, the campus newspaper, the student government. There's a variety of different clubs based around, activities that young people are interested in, whether that's, games or computers, or, different types of art or language and things like that. College is a very unique opportunity as far as that kind of stuff goes, just because there's more infrastructure that exists. And so maybe that gets to your point that you were saying before about the more sort of supply side
Yeah, like that's
based
government creating those
case.
things, or
Well, not
and
necessarily
then
government creating them. I mean, like it's more just that there's an infrastructure that exists, and that people can sort of opt into participating into that pre-existing sort of social infrastructure. But there's challenges with that as well. And like when I was in college, for instance, I remember you join these clubs, and they can sometimes be fun, but sometimes they can be intimidating because they're cliquey, and there's like people that are been involved longer than you, and they're very entrenched, and they want to do things one way, and that they're not very receptive to new ideas and that kind of stuff. And there was there's been there was some Substack post. I can't remember the author now. Some big shot author who wrote about trying to get involved in a pre-existing community organization, and he was talking about how frustrating he found the experience because it was already someone else's thing, right? Like it was already very much dominated by a different sort of group of people who had their way, and that they weren't terribly interested in sort of hearing from newcomers who had ideas about how the club should be run and all of that. And that's a legitimate concern as well, which is why, again, like if you're starting something organically with you and your friends, it will probably be, I think, more satisfying, especially if you're kind of somebody who's maybe a little, I don't know, strong-willed like myself. Some people are perhaps less so, and perhaps some people are a little bit more eager to be part of somebody else's thing, and for there to be rules and perhaps a higher premium placed on sort of conformity. But yeah, I think it does depend on the people.
yeah, I on the restaurants note, I want to say like that's largely like my third place of choice too, and I like enjoy that a lot. But then I do get this kind of like resentment about people telling me to like eat out less or something, or to like just like
Yeah,
kind of like stay inside or like not. And I'm like, well, but like I have to develop like these relationships like somehow, like, and like I
yeah,
feel like my formative years are just like so important for me that like I don't really mind um uh spending the resources that I have to like make these kinds of like connections that can like
yeah.
really benefit me now, as opposed to like saving up and then oh yeah, I can go to restaurants in like my 40s when I'm sad and single and depressed or whatever.
No,
So,
it's true. It's like anything that matters to you, you have to be willing to make an investment in. I mean, that's what money is for, right? And I guess if I am remembering though now that I remember when I was living on my own with my roommate, one thing that we did that was actually a very good sort of third space was that we would often host dinner parties for our friends. My
yeah, like you
roommate
do
was quite a good
cooking and
cook, and
potlucks, and then your parents can be more proud of you because
yeah,
oh, you're saving money, you're learning recipes. Yeah,
yeah. But like I agree though with what you're saying, right? Like ultimately, like you should not be shamed for spending money on activities that allow you to get closer to your friends and stuff like that. Like, yeah, like money is important when you're young. You do have to develop good, sort of responsible, frugal habits, but there's a lot of ways you can do that without sort of cheaping out on friends.
yeah. That's basically just where I'm coming from. I know we might have like some
Yeah.
like temperamental differences, but I basically just don't want to be shamed for my restaurant activities or my poker activities or whatever. But I can understand the differences there. Um,
Yeah.
so you had a funny article about um, U.S. politics has too many Canadian pundits, and I want to ask you a
Oh
little bit
yeah.
about the punditry scheme. And I want you to help me come up with like a new term for I guess it's like foreign aid or something, because like I made the video about the, like democratic autopsy and like the foreign interference,
Yeah.
and how unfortunately like one of our greatest like cultural exports, um like Jordan Peterson, is basically
Yeah.
become like foreign interference like the US. And I would argue is like a
Yeah.
mostly destabilizing, um, polarizing force in the
Mm.
U.S. So I want to ask, like, how can we send foreign aid to the U.S. by giving U.S. politics better Canadian pundits like you, or that can
Well,
serve as a more defender of the institutions, for example?
I mean, so like that article that I wrote about Canadian or American politics has too many Canadian pundits. It was sort of like observed, it was informed by my observation that particularly like on the left, there are a lot of sort of like left-wing Canadian sort of YouTubers, podcaster types who, on the one hand, like lecture a lot about, who should or shouldn't get elected in America, blah, 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 which, what the agenda of the Democratic Party should or shouldn't be, and cheering on this or that outcome over other ones. But then at the same time, a lot of these people are just kind of like broadly anti-American themselves. Like they don't like America, they don't want to live in America, they don't really like Americans, they look down their nose at American sort of patriotism and the American political system, which they consider to be deeply inferior to the Canadian one. And like to me, that I don't like. Like that seems weird. Like that seems like you are using America either like A as a form of entertainment or B as a kind of like, just ideological laboratory in which to sort of play out your various kind of like political fantasies while also not being terribly invested in the country as a whole. Whereas like my interest in American politics comes primarily from a real love of America and a real desire to see America sort of succeed. And not just sort of succeed in a narrow, sort of like Canadian self-interested way, where it's like when America succeeds, Canada succeeds, even though that's objectively the case, but also because like I do believe America is just kind of a force for good in the world unto itself. America has built the modern world in so many ways, countless ways, which I often document in the videos that I make for my channel. The degree to which so much of global culture, everything from toothpaste to aeroplanes, comes from the United States. And so I think that's something that we should be very grateful for. And I think it's also something that we should want to see continue. I think we should want to see that kind of dynamism that came from, in my opinion, sort of like the two great eras of American culture, which was sort of the late 19th century and the mid 20th century. We should want that energy to continue, and we should want to encourage sort of currents in American life and American culture that are in that spirit and be very critical of currents in American life that are against it. Currents in American life that are anti-American, that go against the American way, that go against democracy and, free markets and innovation and sort of entrepreneurship and individualism and personal freedom and all these other good things that have made America such an exceptional country. So any interest in, I think, American politics and any desire to kind of like intervene in American politics and try to sort of steer it in one direction or another, or culturally steer it in one direction or another, I think must always kind of come initially from a position of love for the US. And I think that when you're doing it from that kind of motive, you're not really foreign interfering at all. Foreign interference, in my sense, is like when foreigners are seeking to manipulate the fate of a nation for their own sort of self-serving interests, or even for a kind of frivolous amusement. But when you're doing it because you sincerely like want the country to be successful on its own terms, not in relation to any other country, but just because the successful America is something that is just objectively good, then I think that it's fair to have an investment in that in that political process.
Okay, I like that. Canadian pundits should come from like a place of love, and the article kind of spoke to me a little bit because another article you wrote about how just how I think some like how do you say it? I don't like the term, but it's like America files or something. um,
Yeah.
and like they'll like in Canada, we'll get shamed for it, like because of like their interest in like in American politics.
Mm.
And that's something like I've somewhat like experienced just for somewhat my lack of interest in Canadian politics or lack of knowledge in Canadian
Yeah.
politics. But it really just comes out as a matter of like intrinsic. motivation and like interests, and like what kinds of stories like speak to me. And it just so happens that the kinds of stories and things in the news and Canadian politics recently have not really spoken to me. And like honestly, like our question periods, the couple that I've watched have just been um so much like the same, like one after the other, and like it just seems very stagnant period in our politics.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's fair as well. I mean, like a lot of people are interested in American politics because it is more dynamic. You know, American politics, I think, are more democratic, and you know, people sometimes see that as a controversial thing when I say it, because I feel like in the non-American world, even in the American world, you're often sort of given this line that America's like barely a democracy at all, and blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
the
And I think that
Republic.
like no, 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 like
Or,
not even like that. Like I mean, like this kind of like lefty kind of critique. It's like, well, American democracy is so corrupted and ruined by big business and bad political institutions and blah 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 that you can barely call it a democracy at all. No, it's like I think America is actually very democratic in the sense that like at any given time, there's just a much broader sort of array of issues that are being debated and adjudicated through the media, through the Congress, than there are in most other countries. Like, I think that in a lot of countries, especially a country like Canada, there's just like a very closed kind of set of debates, and everything else. It's like, well, that's settled. That debate is closed. Don't talk about this. Don't talk about that. You know, we've settled that. There's just like this small little narrow sort of slice of issues that you're allowed to discuss, and everything else is kind of off the table. Whereas in America, they, for better or for ill, and I do think that in this current age, we're starting to see sort of the limits of having everything on the table, and sort of some of the ways in which that is perhaps, even though it's good from a democratic sort of sense, it might be sort of socially destructive in some ways. But that being said, it's just like, if you're interested in ideas, if you're interested in conversations, if you're interested about sort of tackling everything under the sun without any sort of restraint of taboo or propriety, well, then America's the country to be into, because it just gives writers and intellectuals and philosophers and all the rest just so much to sort of play with and work with, and sort of test their skills and theories and all that part of their brain on. But you know, again, that can be good or bad. I do think that we should be skeptical of just using America as a kind of intellectual playground, or a space to kind of treat as a kind of reality show where, you know, you follow politics and political debates because you're kind of vicariously invested in them, or you're just kind of like curious to see how this will all play out, as opposed to because you have a sort of like deep, sincere concern for America as America. And that if America went in the wrong direction, you would be sort of bothered by that on its own terms, in the same way that you would be bothered if a loved one made a terrible decision. Like if someone very close to you made a terrible decision, you know, you wouldn't just be kind of like, oh, this is interesting, just like, you know, a plot twist in some, you know, Netflix show that you're watching. You would actually be deeply disturbed by it. And that's kind of how I have felt with some of the recent political developments in America. I've been disturbed by them as somebody who has made sort of a love for America, you know, a big part of my own life and a big part of my own worldview.
hmm. And just to completely veer to the opposite of that, I want to ask you about what you're optimistic about for in America in like the coming years.
Mm.
I need an optimism pill in
Well,
my life.
I mean, the big thing is just that, I mean, now that I'm old, now that I'm at midlife, right, I have sort of realized that, you know, like, this is a kind of cliche, but the pendulum does swing back and forth, right? Nothing is really kind of sustainable forever. I mean, even if we use like the most extreme example, like say Nazi Germany, right? It's like they had a horrible Nazi government, but it didn't last forever. They had a horrible, hideous world war that had to be fought to get rid of that government, but you know, ultimately it went away. You know, you look at dictatorships around the world, you know, you look at you know, the Assad government in Syria just fell. You know, that was a terrible dictatorship that lasted for decades, but it eventually went away. You know, there's more sort of less monstrous examples. Like I remember I was in Chile a few years ago. They had a terrible dictatorship that lasted for 15 years. Now Chile is a wonderful, democratic, free, prosperous society, right? So even like the bleakest examples pass eventually. And America seems like it's in a pretty dark political culture moment right now, but I do remain pretty confident that it will pass. People will get tired of it. People will get bored of it. People will get bored of conspiracy theories and demagoguery and personality cults and all of the other sort of toxic things that Trump has brought into politics. And they'll ultimately vote for something else. And the kind of style of politics that Trump represents will at some point not be considered cool anymore, just in the same way that so many political movements of the past that at one time seemed all encompassing and all powerful fall out of fashion as well. You know, it's we as humans are pretty adaptable creatures, and we can make pivots much sharper than I think can often seem possible to entertain in the moment. So I feel like cautiously optimistic that at some point in the future, people will be interested in the kind of politics that matter a lot to me, a kind of more thoughtful politics, a politics that values legitimate, knowledge and facts. So I don't know. It's just because, like, I guess I was a young man. I was about your age, sort of in the George W. Bush era, for instance, right? And that was like a very distinct political climate and distinct political culture. And it's just like it feels like such another universe now. Like it just feels like we're so far, like nothing about politics today resembles that political world. And yet we just moved away from it. And it never really kind of like had a firm resolution. We just kind of like gave that up. And now we're in a completely different political climate in America. And so just I sometimes just reflect on that. And I just think how remarkable it is that the channel could just be changed. And so, this Trump era seems very inescapable as well, but at some point it won't be. At some point the channel will be changed and then we'll look back and we'll think like, remember when we were talking in 2025? I mean, even if we even bother to remember this, if we're not already so past it that we don't even care, what happened, 10 years ago. I don't know. I I I just believe that there's a lot of fluidity in the world, and there's a lot of fluidity in the political world in particular. So we should never get into the mindset of being so pessimistic that we think that sort of the negative trends are destined to define reality forever, and the positive trends are just kind of like naive, faint hope.
Yeah, I think that's what we all need right now is just like some imagination of like of the future era where you don't even actually
Mm.
think about Trump anymore. Like not just the day after Trump,
Yeah,
but actually like the decade after Trump. Like what are the
yeah,
kinds of opportunities and like infrastructure we can build so that me when I hit like 40, like I can look back at like this, like all the work and all the doom scrolling and all the stuff I'm doing like right now. Like I want to be able to look
yeah,
and have the experience like you did with like the Bush era, and like that was quite the time. But here we are, and
yeah.
we're doing well.
I mean, you create like, everybody who's in these kind of positions, like we're all creating our own little seeds. We're all planting sort of something in the soil. And, it might sprout into something big, or someone else's seed might sprout into something big. But, somebody is going to get lucky. Somebody's going to be the right man in the right place at the right time. Just in the same way, like Joe Rogan was. Like, I mean, like Joe Rogan, like he's just some guy. A lot of guys made podcasts. For some reason, his took off and is now the biggest thing in the world. In the same way that like I remember, like Facebook, right? Like I remember there was a time when there was like a million social media sites, and it wasn't at all obvious that like Facebook was going to be the one that was going to conquer the world, but it did for some reason. And I believe that someone right now is planting the seed of something that's going to be a post kind of Trump political phenomenon. Pardon me, something that is more thoughtful and inquisitive and moderate in its disposition. And at one point, like that will seem exciting and thrilling and cool, and people will want to be a part of it, and it will be considered a good virtue signal to be associated with it in the way that now it's kind of seen as being virtuous to be associated with some of these demagogic sort of cultural institutions that exist in the 2020s. So I don't know, just like having seen how this kind of stuff goes, in waves and all of that, there's going to be a new one at some point. And, it might not be you, it might not be me, it might not be anybody that we've even currently heard of. But yeah, I do believe that the seed has probably been planted now, and it's just a matter of time to keep your eyes peeled for when it starts to bloom.
It's going to be an H1B visa immigrant that plants that seed that
Yeah, probably.
transforms the next generation. That'll be exciting. Um, I want to give you a little bit of a period if you have any questions for me or
Huh.
something for the younger generation, if you've thought of anything.
I didn't really sort of think about that, but that's an interesting question. I mean, do you notice radicalization among your peers, or do you feel like that's just more something that you hear is happening as opposed to something that you witness is happening?
Um, no, I would say I think I definitely like witness or like hear about it, and it's not really like in person, but it mostly
Yeah.
manifests like through what kinds of like media they consume and then how they like talk to me about it. And it's like I do
Mm,
notice like like friends that like used to like not be into politics at all that are like listening to like Candace Owens now. So
yeah, yeah.
and it could just be like a selection bias because I am obviously someone that's like passionate about politics, so I have a certain friend group that can be like that. But I I don't get the sense that the radicalization is like only a phenomenon in journals or whatever. Like it's
Mm.
it's among my peer group, and
And
it's not easy to
when
point to
you,
points, but it is gradual.
yeah. But what do you think, at least when it comes to the position of young people, like what do you think is the most seductive to them about some of this more radical politics? Like if you kind of had to feel like there's a particular entry point for a lot of young people into this kind of world, do you think there's like a specific issue or cause or something like that?
I think primarily it's like the larger than life causes, like the big ones like war or like COVID, are basically like my prime
Yeah,
examples, or even like people are probably going to get radicalized into becoming like Canadian nationalists over like this imaginary war or something. But I think the most
yeah,
appealing thing is frankly just the lack of information and experience and knowledge we have at this point. Um, so it is really appealing to kind of have like a grand theory that like explains like all of your like lack of knowledge about the world, but gives you like a lot of confidence to be able to like talk about that in discourse, and then you can kind of like
mm,
socially signal, and it gets you, and it makes you like a little bit fun at parties, and it can get you like a certain set of friends, and it gets you like a group,
yeah.
but like
That's
without any
interesting.
like the
Yeah.
underlying like information, right? Like tell
Mm.
me like I don't really get a lot of social approval for buying this book, JJ. So like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or like I'm sure I'll get like a lot of value out of it, but like I'm like you said um like all of our attention spans are like a little bit degraded, and it's like pretty hard to like get through a book and like find the time to and peace in your life to be able to want to engage in hard fact finding. So frankly, like I can understand like the appeal in like my own life is like why would I want to read that this one book if I can take or like any number of books to explain any number of phenomenons about the world when I can kind of take
Yeah.
one other like kind of like radical theory that I've read about in like a Reddit post or like watched like a couple of shorts or like videos on. And it's just I think it's basically just as simple as like people can often take like the easier path and use
Yeah.
that to explain the world, the scary world out there.
Mm. No, that tracks. I mean, that certainly is coherent with my own kind of like worldview, which is that, yeah, young people need to learn more basic facts about the world, more fact-based knowledge, because if they don't, that does lead them to be kind of easy marks for these kind of shortcuts to knowledge, these kind of like comprehensive totalizing theories, conspiracy theories, basically, that purport to explain, here's how it really works, and you don't need to do any hard work. You just need to learn this one sort of this one weird trick to get smart overnight.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean that's interesting to hear that you observe that.
I think we just need to bring bullying back. We got to bully, like
Dummies,
we got to bully dummies, yeah. Or your
yeah,
favorite word is dope, dopey. That's
dopes,
one I've
dopey
noticed.
people. Yeah,
Yeah, you like dopey a lot, and I kind of
I
like
do
it
like
too.
dopey.
It's grown on me. Like I was thinking it as like oh, it's like such a middle aged term, but
Mm.
Now I think I want to use it more, just because like I think it explains the phenomenon without ascribing like a lot of like guilt or like malice, because like it's not like
Yeah.
they necessarily hold these theories out of um malice. It's one of those it's not Occam's razor. It's not, it's just like it's easier to explain it through like stupidity rather than like malice, like any of their
Yeah.
crazy like
Yeah.
radical theories. And frankly, I think you can just kind of like, and I think the current's like kind of moving there. Like people are getting like bullied for watching like too much brain rot or like stimming for like 12 hours or whatever. And like
Yes.
I think that's like a good thing, and that's an example of like your of like the pendulum swinging, that it has provided us so much like entertainment or value. But I think we're kind of hitting the end point of that now and realizing how little that these theories actually serve to like as like models for like the future, and like they don't really serve to like actually explain reality unless you're
Yeah.
delusional. So I think eventually the pendulum will come to swing back, and we'll start to venerate or like the people around us that are a little bit more informed with reality, a little that can make better predictions about the future, or at least have like a more humble sense of what the future holds. And they don't claim to like have all the answers. They just claim to have like a certain set of things that they choose to feel confident about, and they can speak with expertise in this little sector. That's what I'd frankly like to see. I'd just like to see the have people that just like go back to their sector instead of like becoming the gurus
Yeah.
that like talk about everything, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. No, it's true, and that requires a certain degree of modesty, which is not very valued in the modern culture today. Everybody has to be a know-it-all about everything, and I think that that sort of social pressure does create an incentive towards, seeking out these kind of totalizing theories. So it's difficult, right? Like there is a certain balance to be reached between being a dope on one hand who is sort of shamed for being dopey, and then being somebody who's insecure about their dopiness, that they sort of seek out sort of a totalizing conspiracy theory worldview to compensate for that. And I think that's why, things like cultural literacy are an important way to sort of think about this, where it's like, the goal should not be that we all become, complete brainiacs who know everything about everything, but that we know enough kind of just shared cultural terms and references and, and just basic gists of things that we can communicate confidently with one another, and that there is some body of sort of shared knowledge that we're all properly educated in, and then we can, have political conversations that begin from some sort of shared base of understanding, rather than, a conversation where one person believes the government is run by lizard people and the other person believes the government's run by, the Illuminati or whatever.
yeah. I want to end with a little something like I'm optimistic about, which is one
Okay.
of my favorite quotes is how Snyder thinks that uh, the 2016 election, or he would probably even say the 2024 election, might have had a different outcome if average screen time in the US was, instead of like 8 hours, was like 6 hours. He thinks like that was basically like
Mm,
the difference. And like it serves as an explainer for how people become like atomized or like have less friendships, and then seek those kinds of like more conspiratorially oriented like podcasts or like subreddits or sub communities. Um,
mm,
and in reference to the optimism, I guess I'm just optimistic to kind of see um, the rise of writers like Jonathan Haidt and like and phone bands in like Australia. And I
yeah.
think that's something like optimistic to look forward to as we become like more skeptical of big tech and the influence we've let phones have over our lives, and also just like how much influence it has like in our schools and like our friendships. And I think I think just a great starting point is addressing it in like elementary and high school, like through like phone lockers or some kind of like regulation. Or I think
Yeah.
something I'm more in favor of is like the phone slush fund, where like schools can like opt into it and then like get a lot of resources based on them like regulating like phone usage in schools, where we've been like
Mm,
pretty soft handed on it. And like we're trying this like a little bit on Ontario, and it's like in the works. So that's something I'm optimistic about, is governments becoming more responsible and realizing that they have to control for like the negative externality of what phones have done to us, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I do wonder about that. I wonder if there's any chance at all that people will get sick of phones at some point. I don't know. Maybe that's kind of naive. I do sometimes wonder, like, if we're like how things are going to change once we start to hit a bit of a plateau as far as phone technology goes, because that's definitely something that I feel like I'm starting to witness a bit, and with computers as well. Like that, it seems like, there was a time for most of my adult life where these things seemed like they were getting better at a sort of exponential clip. But in the last couple of years, it feels like the first time where it kind of feels like the phone is about as good as it's going to get. And even like the laptop, that I'm using right now, kind of feels like it's about as good as it's going to get. Like it feels like the ability to kind of like take it to the next step doesn't really seem like it's going to happen. So I don't know. Like, are people going to still be as mesmerized by this sort of screen-based technology when it becomes, somewhat more mundane and familiar and kind of less changing? I don't know. Maybe that's naive. Maybe we'll all be addicted to our Apple Vision headsets or whatever. But I don't know. It
So
doesn't seem like it's because it's like we watch less cable TV now, for instance, right? Like that used to be sort of the great addiction that when you read the sort of social theorists in the 80s and 90s, they said would be the downfall of humanity. And, we still obviously consume a lot of screen time, but we do it in a slightly different way. So I don't know. I think that there's probably a technological sort of element to this that people are kind of taking for granted will be constant, and I'm just kind of saying that maybe I would have a few of my dollars invested in a theory of technological change that might sort of push the culture in a slightly different way. I'm not 100% optimistic by any mean, but it seems to me it's a not non-zero chance.
yeah, I think things will get a lot worse and then they'll get better. Frankly,
Yeah, well, that's often how it is.
you know. Well, thanks a lot for coming on and speaking with me, JJ. I really enjoyed our conversations, and I
Yeah,
really
it's great,
enjoy
Kevin.
your videos and the kind of influence you choose to have.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. I always like having long, meaningful conversations with people, Kevin. So it was a pleasure to participate.
Yeah, I hope to do this again sometime soon when we have a new prime minister, and then we'll have a third prime minister, and hopefully not a fourth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. God, let's hope not.
All right, thanks. Bye, JJ.
See you. Bye bye.